The dawn of March 23rd, 1945, crept slowly over the shattered landscape of eastern Germany. Mist hung low across the frozen fields, swallowing the wreckage of burned-out vehicles and abandoned equipment. The skeletal remains of farmhouses rose like charred ghosts from the ground, their roofs collapsed, their windows staring blankly into the grey morning. Smoke from distant fires hung like a veil in the sky, and the wind carried the acrid tang of gunpowder and frostbitten earth. In a muddy gun pit overlooking a narrow forest road, a young man sat quietly beside a cold steel anti-tank gun, his gloved hands resting on his knees. His name was Franz. He was 18 years old, a gunner in what remained of the Wehrmacht, and this was the morning he would make a stand that defied all logic, not for glory, but simply because retreat seemed more frightening than staying. Franz had not always been a soldier. Just 18 months earlier, late 1943, he had been an apprentice electrician in Dresden, wiring homes and dreaming of peacetime engineering. His father had fallen at Kursk, a casualty of one of the war's most brutal tank battles. His mother, a stoic woman hardened by hunger and fear, was reduced to queuing for bread in a city that would soon burn under Allied bombs. When the draft papers arrived, there was no surprise in the household, only grim acceptance. Like millions of other boys, Franz was told he would defend the fatherland. The posters promised honour. The streets whispered only of death. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In the months that followed, Franz learned quickly. The Reich's desperation had stripped training of anything approaching comfort. He was taught to load and fire an anti-tank gun, to dig trenches, to move quietly through snow-laden forests. His instructors spoke of strategy and tactics, but Franz learned more from survival. The smell of wet wool, the sound of artillery echoing through a hollow valley, the metallic tang of blood frozen in the snow. He learned to sleep in holes barely larger than his body, to watch the horizon for hours without moving, to count the enemy's tanks and imagine the calculations of their crews. The world he knew had narrowed to this pit, this cold steel piece of artillery, and the barren landscape that stretched ahead. He had friends, older men, veterans of campaigns that had scarred them more than any wound could, but many had fallen in recent weeks, swallowed by the unstoppable tide of Soviet armour. Franz often thought about his past life with a pang of disbelief, as if it belonged to another man entirely. He remembered evenings spent with his mother, soldering wires and joking about the smallest household inconveniences. He remembered Dresden before the firestorm, the hum of trams along cobblestone streets, the smell of bakeries in the morning. Those memories were sharp knives in the icy pit of his current reality. On that morning, the forest road below his position was empty, but Franz knew it would not remain so for long. Intelligence reports, scarce, fragmented, often contradictory, had spoken of Soviet armoured columns moving westward, pushing through the eastern provinces with ruthless efficiency. He thought of the sheer weight of machinery, T-34 seconds and IS-2 seconds, their steel hulls glinting like predators in the mist, supported by infantry armed with rifles, machine guns, and determination forged in years of relentless fighting. Franz was alone, save for the small group of men assigned to him, and their weapons were pitifully outmatched. The gun he sat beside was cold, its barrel long and unyielding, a single point of resistance against a tide that could crush him without hesitation. Franz's mind wandered to the notion of valour, a word so often bandied about in speeches and propaganda, but rarely felt in the gut of a young man staring down death. Valour was not about medals, or parades, or speeches. It was measured in seconds, in choices made while the body screamed for flight. The decision to stay, to fire that gun at the inevitable approaching enemy, was not heroic in the abstract. It was born of fear, instinct, and a stubborn refusal to surrender to panic. Retreat was a word heavy with consequences. The road behind him led to nothing but chaos, strafed villages, and the unknown mercy of fate. Hours passed in silence. Franz observed the landscape with an almost unnatural attentiveness, noting every shadow and shimmer on the road, every bird startled into flight by the unnatural quiet. Occasionally, he adjusted the gun's elevation, checking the recoil, the alignment. His hands were numb despite the gloves, the metal cold enough to bite through cloth. Yet he found a rhythm in the routine, a small comfort in the predictability of preparation. He whispered to himself fragments of electrical formulas, numbers and sequences he had learned as an apprentice, small mental exercises to stave off panic. Around midday, the first signs of movement appeared. A column of armoured vehicles emerged through the mist, headlights faint against the grey morning. They advanced slowly, cautiously, unaware of the lone gunner and his pit. Franz's heart pounded, but his face remained expressionless. His training took over. He checked the range, calculated trajectory, adjusted for wind and elevation. The first shell was loaded, the next two followed. He breathed in measured, controlled puffs, trying to mask the tremor in his hands. The first shot struck a Soviet tank squarely in the turret. There was a flash, a roar, and then silence. Franz could scarcely believe it. The recoil had knocked him back in the pit, but the effect was undeniable. One tank was immobilized, burning slowly as smoke spiraled into the sky. The sound of alarmed shouts carried faintly on the wind, but the rest of the column pressed forward. Franz's training gave him rhythm. One shot, adjust, fire again. Shells screamed across the mud and mist, impacting with explosive force against steel. Minutes stretched like hours. The mist began to lift, revealing the full extent of the Soviet advance. Franz could see more tanks approaching, infantry following behind, their boots sinking in mud churned by armoured vehicles. Around him, his small group of comrades fired sporadically, their rifles cracking against the hum of engines and the roar of artillery. Fear was omnipresent, a living thing that clawed at his spine, but Franz pushed it down with every calculation, every careful aim. And yet, as effective as the gun was, the reality was inescapable. They were vastly outnumbered. Franz knew, with the clarity of someone who has stared long into the abyss, that he might not survive the day. Each tank destroyed slowed the enemy but did not stop the tide. Each shell fired brought a fleeting moment of triumph, immediately countered by the knowledge of what lay beyond the next rise of terrain. In that pit, in the frozen mud, Franz experienced a strange blend of exhilaration and terror, the pure, unfiltered essence of war. Hours later, when the last tank had passed or been stopped, Franz surveyed the field. Smoke and fire mingled with mist, creating an eerie, almost otherworldly tableau. Bodies, friend and foe alike, lay strewn across the road and in the fields, their faces frozen in expressions of surprise, determination, or resignation. Franz's own hands were raw, his fingers blistered and shaking, but he felt a strange calm descend. He had faced the unimaginable, and while survival was uncertain, the act itself had defined him more than any medal or commendation ever could. In the days that followed, Franz would retreat alongside the remnants of his unit, moving westward through villages burned and abandoned, through towns echoing with the cries of the wounded and the dying. Yet the memory of that morning, the cold pit, the misted fields, the singular focus on the steel gun and the narrow road would remain with him. It was not a memory of glory, nor of heroism in the conventional sense, but of a young man confronting fear with nothing but resolve and the tools at hand. Franz Huber's stand on March 23, 1945, is a microcosm of the countless moments that defined the human experience of war. Ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances, making choices that were terrifying, necessary, and profoundly human. He would live, eventually, to return to Dresden, to repair wires instead of firing shells, to feel again the warmth of a family home rather than the cold of a mud-filled gun pit. But the war had changed him irrevocably. In that crucible of fire, frost, and steel, Franz discovered the calculus of survival, the mathematics of fear, and the strange, quiet dignity of endurance. And though history might not remember his name, nor record the Exact count of tanks he had destroyed, the essence of that morning endures, a testament to the resilience of youth, the burden of duty, and the unremarkable courage of a boy who became, for a single day, the measure of his own humanity. Training had taken place near Potsdam under the brutal winter of 1944. There, Franz learned to operate the Pak-40, a 75mm anti-tank gun capable of penetrating nearly any Allied armour at close range. His instructor, a scarred veteran from the Eastern Front, had delivered one unforgettable lesson. Speed and nerve will keep you alive. Hesitation will kill you faster than any tank. In those grinding weeks, Franz met the men who would become his crew. There was Klaus, the loader, wiry, quick-handed, forever whistling old folk songs to calm his nerves. And Dieter, the spotter, barely 17, a farm boy whose laughter still carried traces of innocence. Together they formed the skeleton of an anti-tank team that officers optimistically called a mobile, a defense unit. In truth, they were little more than 3 teenagers with one working gun and orders to delay the inevitable. Their journey to the front began in early March 1945. The train was packed, reeking of diesel and despair. Through frosted windows, Franz saw landscapes he no longer recognized, villages reduced to rubble, bridges twisted over icy rivers. Civilians stared as the train passed, not cheering, not waving, only watching with hollow eyes. Somewhere near Frankfurt and Der Oder, the train halted for hours while Soviet aircraft circled overhead. When the men finally arrived near the Oder River, the world around them looked as though it had already ended. The Eastern Front was collapsing. The Red Army had crossed into German soil, and the remnants of the once proud Wehrmacht fought in scattered pockets, improvising defences among ruins. Soviet supply columns, endless rivers of trucks and armour, kept the enemy fed with ammunition and fuel. By contrast, Franz's unit shared a single ration tin between 3 men. They had 12 armour-piercing shells, 1 radio with dying batteries, and orders to hold the position at all costs. Yet, even in that bleak landscape, the crew clung to fragments of humanity. They shared stories around a small fire made of broken fencewood, joked nervously about home, and imagined against all evidence that they might walk back together when it ended. Franz would clean his gun lovingly each night, oiling the breech as though it were sacred. "A gun," he once told Dieter, "doesn't lie. It does exactly what you tell it to do." That morning, as the fog began to thin, Franz heard engines in the distance, deep, methodical, mechanical thunder rolling closer. He looked at Klaus, who was already loading a shell into the breech. Dieter adjusted his field glasses, scanning the tree line. "Panzers," he whispered, "ours or theirs?" The answer came moments later when the first shape emerged from the mist, a T-34, its red star, barely visible through the mud caking its hull. Then another. And another. Franz counted silently. 10, 15, 20. The column kept coming. "Soviet armour," Klaus breathed. "At least 40 tanks. No one spoke. They all understood what those numbers meant. 40 tanks against 1 gun. 3 boys against an army. Franz Huber, the boy who had dreamed of building radios, tightened his grip on the gun's traverse wheel and whispered a prayer not for victory, but for courage enough to fire the first shot. By mid-morning on March 23rd, 1945, the road through the forest had become a killing ground. Franz's gun pit overlooked a narrow choke point, where Soviet armour funneled through dense pines. The terrain was his only advantage, and he intended to use every metre of it. The lead T-34 rumbled forward, tracks grinding against frozen mud. Franz centred the crosshairs on its side armour, just below the turret ring. "Range 200 metres, he called quietly. "Loaded," Klaus answered, his voice tight. Franz exhaled slowly. "Fire!" The Pak-40 roared. The recoil slammed into his shoulder like a hammer. Through the smoke, he saw the shell strike true orange flame erupting from the tank's flank. The T-34 lurched sideways, smoke pouring from its hatches. Behind it, the column halted abruptly. "Reload!" Franz barked. Klaus worked with desperate speed, slamming another round into the breach. Dieter's voice crackled with panic. "They're deploying infantry, 50 meters left flank." Franz ignored him. He had to focus on the armor. The tanks were the threat. Everything else was noise. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The second shot punched through another T-34's frontal plate at close range. The tank erupted in a ball of fire, its ammunition cooking off in a chain of explosions. Burning crew members stumbled from the wreck, collapsing into the snow. "3 shells left," Klaus shouted. Franz cursed under his breath. They'd expended 9 rounds in less than 20 minutes. But the Soviet column had stopped advancing. Confusion rippled through their ranks, commanders uncertain whether they faced a single gun or an entire battery. "Make them think we're more than we are," Franz muttered. He adjusted his aim, targeting a tank near the rear of the column. The shot struck its fuel tank, and flames roared skyward. Black smoke billowed across the road, obscuring visibility for both sides. For nearly an hour, the Soviets probed cautiously, unwilling to charge blindly into what they believed was a fortified position. Franz used the lull to reposition the gun 15 meters to the left, camouflaging it with branches and torn canvas. When the enemy finally advanced again, they fired at the old position, wasting shells on empty ground. Franz struck twice more before noon, each shot carefully rationed. 2 more tanks burned. The road was now choked with wrecks, forcing the Soviets to maneuver off-road through difficult terrain. Their advance slowed to a crawl. "They're calling up artillery," Dieter warned, his voice trembling. Franz nodded grimly. It was only a matter of time before Soviet spotters triangulated their position. But every minute they delayed was a minute for German forces to retreat across the Oder bridges. By early afternoon, Soviet shells began landing around the gun pit. The ground shook violently. Shrapnel tore through the trees. Klaus was hit fragments ripping through his leg. He collapsed, blood spreading across the snow. Franz dragged him behind the gun shield, pressing a field dressing against the wound. "Stay quiet," he said, though Klaus's face was already pale with shock. Dieter took over as loader, fumbling with the heavy shells. His hands shook badly, but he forced himself to keep working. "How many left?" he gasped. 4, Franz answered. 4 shells, 40 tanks. He returned to the gun and sighted down the barrel. A Soviet commander had dismounted from his tank, shouting orders and pointing toward the gun pit. Franz aimed carefully and fired. The shell struck the tank directly behind the officer, killing him instantly in the blast. The Soviets pulled back again, rattled, cautious, confused by the precision and discipline of what they assumed was a veteran crew. They had no idea they were fighting 3 teenagers. By mid-afternoon, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The radio had gone silent hours ago, leaving the 3 of them isolated in a small gun pit carved from frozen earth and mud. The faint whistle of distant artillery punctuated the oppressive quiet, and the acrid smoke of spent rounds clung to their faces, mixing with sweat and soot. Klaus lay slumped against the edge of the pit, unconscious, his uniform streaked with blood and grime. Dieter sat beside the gun, his shoulders hunched, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and fear, hands gripping the barrel as if it might anchor him to some fragment of courage. "Do we pull back?" Dieter's voice was low, fragile, almost swallowed by the wind through the trees. Franz turned his head slowly, taking in the sight of his comrades, the boyish curve of Klaus's face obscured by dirt, the silent tremor in Dieter's jaw. His own face was smeared with soot, his hands shook despite the gloves. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the inevitability of what they were facing. The thought of retreat offered no comfort. "Where would we go?" he asked quietly, more to himself than to Dieter, his voice taut with fatigue and disbelief at the question. There was no path to safety, only a muddy forest road stretching toward the enemy. He turned back to the gun, checking the alignment with methodical precision, the habits of training overriding the terror in his chest. A tank was attempting to flank through the trees, its turret swiveling, slowly as it sought a vulnerable angle. Franz's second-to-last shell was loaded. He took aim, fingers steady despite the trembling of his arms, and fired. The shell struck the turret with a deafening clang. It did not destroy the vehicle, but it smashed the command hatch, forcing the commander inside to retreat and stall the advance. A fleeting victory, yet enough to buy precious moments, to hold the line for a heartbeat longer. One shell remained, one shot between them and the end. Franz swallowed, the metallic taste of fear rising in his throat. He loaded the final shell himself, the cold steel of the round heavy in his hands, yet somehow steadier than his own pulse. He scanned the forest road below, counting tanks with a weary but unflinching gaze, 30 or more, engines idling, commanders shouting orders in rapid Russian, unaware that a single gun had held them at bay for nearly 4 hours. Franz whispered, almost as a prayer, "One more." He aimed carefully, calculating distance, wind, and angle, all while knowing the fragility of time and fate rested on this one decision. His finger tightened on the trigger. The moment stretched a taut wire straining to break, the air thick with smoke, expectation, and fear. Then he fired. The recoil rattled through his arms, the echo bouncing off the trees like a cannonade, and the shell screamed down the forest road. It struck true, a final act of defiance in a small, frozen corner of the world, where courage had become its own measure of survival, and one boy had held the line against an overwhelming tide. The last shell struck a fuel truck hidden behind the lead tanks. The explosion was catastrophic flames leaping 50 feet into the air, spreading to nearby vehicles. Chaos erupted along the column. Soviet soldiers scattered, believing they were under sustained artillery fire. The gun fell silent. Franz sat back, ears ringing, hands blistered. Around him, the forest burned. The road was impassable. 40. Tanks had been stopped not by an army, but by 3 boys and 12 shells. It wasn't victory, it was only time. But in war, sometimes time is everything. By dusk on March 23rd, 1945, the forest road was a graveyard of steel. Smoke rose in black columns from burning tanks, and the air reeked of oil and scorched metal. Franz Huber sat beside his silent gun, staring at the carnage below. His crew, what remained of it, lay scattered around the pit. Klaus was dead. He had bled out quietly in the afternoon. His last words a whispered request for water Franz couldn't provide. Dieter had been killed by a Soviet sniper an hour later, struck in the head while trying to retrieve ammunition from their supplies. Franz had pulled his body behind the gun shield and covered him with a torn tarp. Now he was alone. The Soviets had finally organized a flanking maneuver, sending infantry through the woods to encircle the position. Franz could hear them moving boots crunching on frozen ground, voices calling to one another in Russian. He had no ammunition left, no way to fight, no way to run. He sat with his back against the gun, hands resting on his knees, and waited. When the Soviet soldiers emerged from the trees, weapons raised, Franz did not move. He simply looked up at them, face blackened with soot, eyes hollow with exhaustion. One soldier shouted at him in Russian. Another kicked the empty ammunition crate, confirming what they had suspected. The gun was spent. An officer approached, a captain with a weathered face and cold eyes. He looked at Franz, then at the 2 bodies, then at the road below, where a dozen tanks still smouldered. The officer said something in Russian sharp, clipped. A translator stepped forward. "How many men were here?" the translator asked. Franz said nothing. The officer repeated the question, this time with anger. Franz finally spoke, his voice hoarse. 3. The translator hesitated, as if he'd misheard. 3 men? 3. Franz confirmed. The officer stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned and barked orders. The soldiers lowered their weapons. Franz was pulled to his feet, hands bound loosely, and led away from the gun pit. As they marched him down the road, Franz glanced back once. His gun, silent, blackened, empty, stood alone against the trees. It had been his companion, his survival, his purpose. Now it was just wreckage. But it had bought 4 hours. 4 hours for German forces to retreat, 4 hours for bridges to be blown, 4 hours that might save hundreds of lives. Franz was taken to a Soviet field camp and interrogated. The officers were incredulous. How could one anti-tank gun delay an entire armoured column? How could 3 teenagers inflict such damage? Franz answered their questions simply, "We had good ground. We aimed carefully. We didn't panic." The senior officer reviewing his case wrote in his report, "Prisoner claims to be 18 years old, appears calm, disciplined, shows no remorse. His gunnery was exceptional, every shot counted. Recommend prisoner be treated with respect, due to a capable adversary." Franz spent the next 3 years in a Soviet POW camp near Smolensk. Conditions were harsh, but he survived. He worked in a factory, kept his head down, and spoke little. When asked about the war, he would only say, "I served." He returned to Germany in 1948, to a nation divided and ruined. Dresden, his home, was a wasteland of rubble. His mother had died during the firebombing in February 1945. There was no house, no family, no future waiting for him. Franz found work as an electrician in West Berlin, married a nurse he met at a clinic, and lived quietly for the next 50 years. He never attended veteran reunions, never spoke publicly of the war. His children would later recall that he avoided military parades and kept no mementos of his service except one, a brass shell casing from a Pak-40, polished and empty, resting on a shelf in his study. For decades, Franz Huber's name appeared nowhere in official records. The stand he made on March 23, 1945, was filed away in Soviet archives as a minor skirmish barely worth mentioning in the grand sweep of the war's final weeks. It wasn't until 1998, when Russian military historians began declassifying Eastern Front documents, that the engagement resurfaced. A researcher named Viktor Petrov discovered a report detailing an unexpectedly fierce resistance from a single German gun position that delayed a mechanized column for over 4 hours. The report included precise details: 12 confirmed tank kills, 8 damaged vehicles, 37 Soviet casualties. The position had been manned by 3 soldiers, all teenagers, armed with a single Pak-40 and 12 shells. Petrov published his findings in a Moscow journal. The story caught the attention of German historians, who cross-referenced Soviet records with Wehrmacht archives. Franz Huber's name emerged. In 2001, a journalist from Berlin tracked him down in a quiet suburb. Franz, now 74, grey-haired and soft-spoken, was reluctant to be interviewed. But eventually, he agreed. "Do you consider yourself a hero?" the journalist asked. Franz looked out the window at the peaceful street beyond. "No," he said quietly, "I was just a boy with a gun. I did what I was told." "But you stopped 40 tanks with 3 men." Franz shrugged. "We had 12 shells. We used them well, that's all." The journalist pressed further. "People call your stand reckless." Franz smiled faintly. It was reckless. But retreat seemed worse. At least if we stayed, we knew what would happen. If we ran, we'd just die tired. The article was published in Der Spiegel under the headline, "The Boy Who Held the Line, 1 Gun, 40 Tanks, 4 Hours." The story resonated across Germany. Veterans wrote letters praising Franz's courage. Historians debated the tactical brilliance of his positioning. Military academies studied engagement as an example of asymmetric defense, how a small, well-trained unit could delay a vastly superior force through discipline and terrain advantage. In 2003, the German government invited Franz to a ceremony honoring forgotten defenders of the Eastern Front. He declined. "I don't need ceremonies," he told his daughter. Klaus and Dieter didn't get any. Franz Huber died in 2009, quietly, in his sleep. His funeral was small family, a few neighbours, no media. But at the graveside, an unexpected visitor appeared. An elderly Russian man, leaning on a cane, wearing a faded military coat. His name was Alexei Sokolov. He had been a tank commander in the Soviet column Franz had stopped 64 years earlier. "I came to pay my respects," Sokolov said in halting German. "He fought well, honourably." Franz's daughter thanked him, tears in her eyes. Sokolov nodded slowly. War is madness. Courage belongs to no nation. Today, near the Oder River, a small memorial stands in the quiet heart of a forest, a place where the chaos and smoke of war have long since been replaced by the soft rustle of leaves and the gentle hum of life returning to the land. This memorial is modest, almost unassuming, yet it holds a story that echoes far beyond its physical boundaries. It was erected in 2012 by a local history group, funded by donations from both German and Russian veterans, men who had once faced one another as enemies but now shared a desire to honour courage, to preserve memory, and to recognise the human cost of conflict. The plaque, simple and solemn, bears a few words, but their weight is immense. Here, on the 23rd of March 1945, 3 young soldiers held the line. Franz Huber, Klaus Schäfer, Dieter Kohl. 1 gun, 12 shells, 4 hours. Remembered. For those who pass through the forest, these words offer a glimpse into a moment frozen in time, a fragment of history that resists the erosion of years. Visitors sometimes leave flowers, their petals, bright against the muted greens and browns of the forest floor. Occasionally, a veteran pauses there, silent, lost in memory. He may trace the names etched in the plaque with a trembling finger or bow his head, his eyes misted with recollections that have been revisited countless times in dreams and quiet moments. The forest has long since reclaimed the scars of battle, the mud-choked trenches, the twisted metal of vehicles, the scorch marks along the tree line. None of these remain. Moss blankets the earth, undergrowth snakes through the hollows where artillery once roared, and birds weave songs through the branches above. The gun pit where Franz Huber had crouched for hours is gone, buried beneath centuries of soil, leaves, and quiet renewal. But the road, the narrow forest path along which history pivoted, still remains. It winds like a silver thread through the trees, a subtle reminder that once, long before the forest had healed, the course of events had hinged on the courage of 3 boys who refused to run. Franz Huber never sought glory. He never claimed to be a hero, nor did he expect anyone to remember his name. To him, survival had been the goal, and every act of courage had been dictated by the relentless arithmetic of fear and necessity. Yet, in the mathematics of war, his equation was undeniable. 1 gun, 3 boys, 12 shells, and 4 hours, an equation that bought time, delayed destruction, and etched a small, defiant mark on the chaos that had consumed so much of the continent. Franz's stand that day had not been about victory in the conventional sense. The enemy pressed relentlessly, armoured vehicles advancing with mechanical precision, infantry moving in coordinated waves, and yet the moment held significance not because the boys had won a battle, but because they had delayed the inevitable. They had transformed hours into an eternity, proving that courage could alter not the outcome of history but its tempo. In war, time is as precious as territory. A single hour gained or lost can determine whether lives are spared or sacrificed. And in that narrow window along the Oder, Franz and his comrades carved 4 hours out of the relentless surge, an interval that allowed retreating forces to regroup, civilians to flee, and the fractured remnants of an army to endure a little longer. The legacy of that day is not one of conquests or medals, but of something quieter and more profound. Valor is often defined by the grand gestures, the battles won, the enemy vanquished, the banners raised, but sometimes it is measured in the persistence of the ordinary, the refusal to yield when everything else has already fallen. Franz, Klaus, and Dieter embodied that quiet valor. They were boys, still too young to have known the world beyond war. Yet they stood when surrender would have been easier, when fear would have justified flight. Their courage was not celebrated in the newspapers of the time, nor heralded in radio broadcasts. It lived only in the immediate impact of their actions and, decades later, in the memories preserved by those who recognized its significance. The forest itself seems to understand this truth. Walking its trails, one cannot help but sense the weight of what occurred beneath the canopy of leaves. Every tree, every rise of earth, every silent clearing carries an imprint of human experience, both fragile and resilient. Moss grows thick over the gun pit, softening the violent scars of the past, yet the presence of the memorial transforms the forest from a place of natural beauty into a hallowed space of remembrance. It is a place where history is not static but alive, where time bends and folds, and where the courage of 3 boys resonates with anyone who passes through. 80 years have passed since that fateful day, and yet Franz Huber's legacy endures not as propaganda, not as myth, but as a quiet testament to the power of human will. He returned home after the war, a young man who had seen more death, destruction, and despair than most people could comprehend in a lifetime. The years that followed were shaped by reconstruction, by the attempt to reclaim normalcy, and by the effort to rebuild a life from the fragments left by conflict. Yet the memory of that day along the Oder River remained indelible. It was a reminder that courage often arises in moments of desperation, that heroism can exist in the smallest of actions, and that the decisions of ordinary individuals can echo across decades. Franz never spoke much of his experiences. The war had taught him that words often fail to capture the essence of fear, the immediacy of choice, or the strange blend of exhilaration and terror that accompanies the act of holding one's ground. He would sometimes sit quietly in the evenings, his hands resting on the worn tools of his post-war trade, and think of the boys who had been with him, of the frozen mud and the roar of engines, of the fleeting victories measured not in territory gained, but in moments earned. It was enough, he believed, that someone remembered, that the forest itself remembered. The bond between the 3 boys was forged in the crucible of that day. Franz, Klaus, and Dieter were connected not by shared ideology or ambition, but by necessity, by the unspoken understanding that survival depended on each other. Each man relied on the other's vigilance, each man trusted the other's skill with the gun and rifle, and each shared the silent promise that they would not falter, no matter the odds. The camaraderie formed in those harrowing hours was a bond that would outlast the war, outlast the rubble of cities, and outlast the fleeting nature of fame or recognition. It was a bond grounded in the simplest, yet most profound elements of humanity: loyalty, courage, and the refusal to abandon those who stand beside you. As visitors walk the path along the forest road today, they may notice the small details, the way sunlight filters through the trees in fragmented beams, the gentle murmur of a nearby stream, the subtle scent of pine and earth. These natural elements contrast starkly with the violence that once defined this place, yet they also serve to highlight the resilience of life. The memorial stands as a bridge between past and present, a tangible connection to the fleeting yet transformative moments that occurred on the 23rd of March 1945. Flowers placed by unknown hands, notes left by strangers, and the occasional pause of a veteran all testify to the enduring impact of actions that, at the time, seemed isolated, insignificant, or futile. The mathematics of Franz Huber's courage is elegant in its simplicity. 1 gun, 3 boys, 12 shells, 4 hours. And yet within this equation lies an entire universe of human experience, fear, resolve, camaraderie, and the confrontation with mortality. Time, in this context, is both a weapon and a reward. By holding the line, Franz and his comrades did not alter the ultimate outcome of the war, but they altered the immediate experience of those around them, delaying the advance of destruction and, for a few precious hours, asserting their own agency in a world determined to overwhelm them. Perhaps the truest measure of valor, then, is not to be found in grand monuments or public accolades, but in these intimate moments where ordinary people are asked to confront the extraordinary. Courage belongs to the young, the frightened, and the forgotten. It belongs to those who, in the absence of expectation or reward, rise to meet the demands of circumstance. Franz Huber's stand is a reminder that history is shaped not only by generals, policies, and battles, but by the decisions made in the mud, the frost, and the silence between gunfire. And so the memorial persists, quietly standing amidst the trees. It honors Franz, Klaus, and Dieter, but it also honors the countless others whose names will never be recorded, whose deeds will never be known, yet whose courage shaped the contours of history in subtle, immeasurable ways. To the boys who, in the final spring of 1945, held a gun, held the line, and held on to something deeper than war itself. The bond between soldiers, the duty to one another, and the refusal to yield when everything else had already fallen. 1 gun, 40 tanks, 4 hours, eternity. The equation is simple, the story is profound, and the forest, now reclaimed by life and silence, bears witness to both the fleeting immediacy of human action and the enduring resonance of courage. For anyone who pauses at the memorial, who listens to the whisper of the leaves and imagines the cold mist of that morning, the lesson is clear. Heroism is not always loud, and valor is not always adorned. Sometimes it is measured in seconds held, decisions made, and the quiet persistence of the human spirit standing firm in the face of overwhelming odds. Franz Huber, his comrades, and their single gun became, for a brief span of time, the axis upon which history shifted. Not through conquest or strategy, not through triumph or reward, but through the most elemental of acts, the refusal to surrender, the determination to endure, and the courage to act when inaction would have been easier, safer, and far more likely. And though the world may forget the names, the numbers, and the specifics, the essence of that stand remains immortal, etched into the soil, the stones, and the hearts of those who remember. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.